Welcome. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you today to today's symposium, Housing in a Place, Planning, Design, and Spatial Justice in Aging Societies. This event is organized and co-sponsored by both the Joint Center and the Hastings Center with funding from the Robert W. Wilson Charitable Trust. For those of you on Twitter, which I'm not, I feel like such an old man when I have to give these statements, but we are using the hashtag aging in a place. So if you're active on social media, please, and watching at home on the web, you can use the hashtag too as well to join the conversation. We'll be monitoring Twitter and trying to incorporate your feedback as well. So I'm talking with friends from the Hastings Center and with Tony Griffin from the GSD, who are all instrumental in today's event, that we often use the analogy of sort of like a wedding, where you have different parts of your life coming together, except this is a wedding where we have a tripartite group of people coming together. So one theme that's going to be obviously central to today is work that's central to the Joint Center, which is our increasingly important work around housing and aging society. That today we'll be featuring, among other things, work that we released yesterday that I think you all got copies of, our new report, Housing America's Older Adults. This was led by Jen Malinsky from the Joint Center, who's a senior researcher at the Joint Center and also a lecturer at the GSD. And Jen also was instrumental in putting together today's event. So that's one stream of our research. And I should mention, too, that this Housing America's Older Adult report was been funded by the AARP Foundation in part, so we're grateful for their support. And Alicia Morris Ryerson, who's with us today, you'll hear from her as well. But this year's report, the theme, the press release from this year's report was the issue of growing inequality among older adult population, which really is reflective of growing inequality across our society, but has certain important implications as well for older adults. And that brings in the second part of the streams of work that we're bringing together today, which is work from the Hastings Center, which is for 50 years has been a leader, if not the leader, in research and public discourse about social and ethical issues in healthcare, science and technology, and including ethical issues around an aging society. And the Hastings Center has, I think, in many respects been heavily concentrated in medical and healthcare issues, but I think as we're seeing increasingly ourselves, that you can't talk about aging and housing without also talking about issues around healthcare as well, instrumental to well-being in older ages, and also incredibly important to coordinate with housing. And then the third theme, and again comes out of our report this year, is issues of inequality, is work by our colleague Tony Griffin, who is a professor in practice in urban planning here at the GSD, has a very distinguished career in public service and her own practice, and her work around looking at social justice in a spatial sense, and her work in the Just City Lab, I think is one that we're also trying to incorporate into this question about how do we think about a just aging society. And so we're bringing those three streams together today. I think it will spur a very interesting conversation, I hope. And I think as we looked at who registered for this event, we were really pleased to be able to kind of live up to the joint in our name, the Joint Center for Housing Studies. And that joint has a certain history, which is that we were originally joint between the two universities, Harvard and MIT. Now we're joint between the Kennedy School of Government and the Graduate School of Design. But really the joint from its founding has been about having a center that is trying to build bridges across different domains to look at important issues. In our case, the issue of housing. And those domains include the worlds of academia, policy, practice, and advocacy. And we have all those folks represented here in the room. And it's also, in an academic sense, bridging different disciplines. And so we have economics, demography, public health, medicine, design professions. All of those professions have an important take on this issue as well. And so we're really pleased to have an opportunity today to bridge those different domains and live up to the joint in our name. We do have a very diverse and very interesting group of people here in the audience. We hope you find many ways to participate in our conversation. The work that Tony does will give you one chance to do that. There's also going to be a break, a reception at the end. So please, across the table, across the aisle, look to make new connections today as well, because that's part of our goal. All right, with that, let me now introduce Milly Salomon. Milly is the president of the Hastings Center, and she's also a bioethicist, a social science researcher, and she's also a Harvard colleague. So again, we're bridging across the divides here. She is a professor of global health and social medicine at the medical school, and she directs a fellowship program in bioethics at Harvard Center for Bioethics. So Milly, really pleased to be doing this with you, so please come up.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to bring you greetings from the Hastings Center. We are a bioethics research institute based in the Hudson Valley in New York, about an hour north of Manhattan. We're committed to building just societies that promote human well-being across the life cycle. The Hastings Center is, as Chris just said, celebrating its 50 years. So this is our 50th anniversary, and I can't think of a better way to celebrate than to be able to be here today and join with the Joint Center in examining one of today's most pressing issues. Many thanks to Chris Herbert for this partnership. We couldn't do this this is a perfect example of collaboration where we're all bringing something unique and complementary. And I want to reiterate thanks to our funder, the Robert Wilson Charitable Trust, which has made this symposium possible. We are deeply indebted to the Robert Wilson Trust, to its generosity and to its vision. I also want to acknowledge the great work and creativity of the program committee that put together the agenda that we're about to walk through. Jen Malinsky at the Joint Center, Emily Greenfield at the Rutgers School of Social Work, and Nancy Berlinger, a research scholar at the Hastings Center and my dear colleague. We're here today to talk about a phenomenon that the world has actually never seen. Humans in wealthy nations are living longer than ever before, much longer. The United States and other wealthy nations are aging societies, which is technically defined as having more people over the age of 65 than under 15. This is a new phenomenon, and it's the result of decades of public health and advances in medicine as well. And of course, it's a good problem to have. I think we all are glad to be the beneficiaries of living at this time, and all personally seeking healthy, long living. But neither our families nor our societies are ready for this. We're going to need to reinvent how we build communities, how we build systems of transportation, and how we ensure social connection for large numbers of people who, yes, will be living much longer, but also inevitably with years of increasing frailty. Problems like housing and transportation and social inclusion require thinking beyond the level of the individual. They require that we plan for systems-level changes at community, state, and national levels. Which brings me to address a question that might be on your mind. Why would a bioethics research institute like Hastings take on problems of housing? Bioethics in general, and the Hastings Center in particular, have led the way in making healthcare more patient-centered. For example, Hastings guidelines on end-of-life, on the use of life-sustaining technologies emphasize patients' rights to direct their own care and have helped to shape the country's laws and norms about what's ethically permissible at the very end of life. But now we have to expand our view in a number of different ways. We have to go much farther than focusing on individual clinical treatment decisions. We need to reach beyond what healthcare itself can do and begin to take a stronger focus on the social determinants of health and well-being. And in this case, in what we're taking up today, a greater emphasis on the social determinants of health means we need to deepen our understanding of the experience of aging and of the reality of being an aging society. And as we learn more about those realities, we need to consider what our obligations are and what they should be across generations. In other words, we need to ask, if we are to meet the needs of older adults, what does citizenship and justice require of us? Our meeting today is going to take a look at that, where you're going to hear from people who are going to propose some describing the problem in more nuance and proposing some solutions and some innovative ways to address those needs. Our first speaker is going to be Nancy Berlinger, so I have the pleasure of introducing her. Dr. Bourlingueur is a Hastings Center scholar, as I've mentioned. She co-directed a project which immediately preceded this, in which we also collaborated with the Joint Center, a special report on aging, which I'm sure she's going to be describing in her remarks. And she obviously focuses on issues of population aging, but she's also engaged in a number of other bioethics issues regarding end-of-life care. She's an expert on immigrant health care and the justice issues that are involved in access to health care for immigrants. And her most recent book is on medical error, so she takes up a big range of eclectic issues. She received her BA from Smith College. She has a PhD in English literature from the University of Glasgow and an MDiv from the Union Theological Seminary. Nancy.
Okay, I'll start with this one. Thank you. English majors. Okay, so this is our place. This is the Hastings Center, founded in 1969, as Milly mentioned, as the world's first bioethics research institute. Our accommodations for visiting scholars overlook the Hudson River. That's West Point across the river. Our offices are in the large house, and then the longer building to the side is where our visitors live. Please come visit us. Academics, practitioners, all are welcome. We're a diverse group here at Harvard today and via live stream. We have policymakers from the state of Massachusetts, the city of Boston, many greater Boston communities, and communities in other parts of the United States. We have experts in aging, in housing, in real estate, in finance, public health, legal services, social services, and grant making. We have plenty of architects, we have plenty of planners, and we have plenty of academics from many disciplines. So this is a notably diverse group to come out for this constellation of issues. Let's see why. Okay, so because we come from such diverse disciplines, we probably encounter the word ethics in different professional contexts. Those of you who are architects or doctors may be aware of the code of ethics in your profession. Others may associate this word with something theoretical, philosophy, or may say, well, I didn't take philosophy, so I can't do this. Fear not. In these 3 slides, I will show you what ethicists, those of us who, like Milly, Salomon, and myself, study and make recommendations about ethically challenging situations, think about and do all day. It's not ivory tower, despite the setting of the Hastings Center, which is quite beautiful. We start with the same questions Aristotle asked. How should we live? And how should we live together? The together part is what makes it ethics. So when we have here, as you can see up here, ethics asks normative questions. That means should questions, ought questions, values questions about actions concerning others, people, populations, other species, spaces, and specific places. Justice, preventing harm, doing good, and respecting persons tend to be key features of ethical analysis, especially in Western societies. We may associate these with the principles of biomedical ethics, but they can be applied to non-medical contexts as well. However, uncertainty is characteristic of ethically challenging situations. For one thing, how do we define the word justice? Do we just mean procedural justice? We have a process, it's fair, that's good enough. Or what about distributive justice or restorative justice, the idea of giving back something that has been taken away in the past? How do we level that field? How do we account for competing values when an effort to do greater justice comes up against the idea of personal rights, personal preferences? How should we perceive when ethical action is blocked by policy, whether at the local, the state, the national, or other level, or by patterns of behavior in a community? This may be the idea of, well, our community values are such, or this is the character of our town, or even we like our housing to look a certain way, so we can't imagine something being different. So those might block what is felt to be the right thing to do. Now, bioethics, what we do at the Hastings Center, explores these exact set of questions in the context of developments in public and population health, such as population aging, also contexts such as healthcare, genetics, biotechnologies, artificial intelligence. We tend to have a practical orientation toward real-world or over-the-horizon challenges, even when we're working on conceptual issues. It's something that we can see coming, that we want to start to get out ahead of. We always work from data. What can we know about a particular topic? That's why I've been following the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies for years before I ever met anyone who worked here, because they are such a great source of data. And we also do critical analysis. Are we asking the right questions? Whose voices should be heard? Whose voices are being ignored? How have we framed the particular problem that we're solving? And we tend to aim at feasible recommendations, because as we say in ethics, ought implies can. You can't just aspirationally talk about justice. You have to get it as street ready as you can, so that others can carry out actionable solutions in whatever sphere they are able to work. So often, we start by looking at how a problem is described. And I know this resonates with the architects and planners in the rooms, because you are always presented with a design challenge. There's always a brief, a problem that you have to solve, or a set of problems involving zoning and land use and budgets and time and so on. So we try to figure out how a problem is being solved as well. Now, frameworks are never neutral. There can sometimes be this magical idea that if we come up with the right words, the PC term, we somehow get values out of it. But somebody decided how to frame something a certain way. So one of the questions we always try to ask is, well, why should we care about this problem? I mean, how do you balance the interests of older adults compared to children, for example, when we have a sense of what a community requires? I'm always interested in our idea of what's a good community. We tend to talk about the schools. We tend to talk about SAT scores, or maybe parks. We may or may not talk about how it is good for older adults, or how people who have paid taxes for those schools and those parks for a very, very long time actually benefit from the community as they age. We may assume that they themselves should be responsible for this, or their families in a kind of nebulous way should be responsible for this. We may talk about who is deserving of help, and we may cut that by saying, oh, we want to provide for people who have been here a long time, or maybe people who have no families, or whatever our idea of deservingness is. We have to think about who is excluded by that, and why are we making that cut in that particular place. And I'm always intrigued, especially when we're outside of the realm of what Medicare funds for healthcare, is what is described as a need, a choice, or a luxury. Because if something that we need is something we cannot afford and is not covered by our insurance, it isn't really a choice to us. So there are many, many aspects of aging in America where things that are presented as choices are really luxuries. They are available to people who have a lot of resources, but they are not available for the typical person, and we will hear a great deal about this in the first panel. So other things I've learned from hanging out with people who are in media studies and who study the discourse of aging, they will point out when a framework that we're using to describe a problem perpetuates stigma, such as ageism or ableism, how do we stop using it rather than imagining it's an alternative way to talk about a problem? When a framework is flawed, it has old data in it or outdated assumptions, how do we counterframe this story to tell a more positive story about affordable housing or accessible housing, rather than saying, oh, that's for people who have special needs, or there's some perpetuation of a stigma attached to it, so people are less eager to get behind it. And how can we replace simple stories, which are easier to remember and maybe more emotionally satisfying to us, with more nuanced stories? We see this in every area of public conversation, and it certainly comes up when we think about how to use public space in a town. I was giving an earlier version of this talk a few months ago at another Ivy League university, and someone came up to me, and she was from a very well-to-do town, whose name I recognized, and she said, oh, in our town, we tried to talk about affordable housing for middle-income people in our wealthy town, and we were talking about some public land where we could have built housing, but there was so much tension, we just decided to leave it open and wild and talk about it that way. And she said, that doesn't do any good for the older people in our town. They can't camp there. And so people are aware of these tensions, but they may not be sure how they get past them, because it's hard to argue against parkland. I mean, that's a good thing too. So we really get to very practical nitty-gritty issues when we start to talk about the set of topics that we're talking about today. So that was the quickie version of ethics. So now you all realize you're all officially ethicists. Population aging is a long-term demographic trend in wealthy societies with developed public health systems and public health and healthcare systems. It produces longevity. You could even say that a society achieves a status as an aging society on a large scale. It is not a natural disaster. It's not caused by people living too long or failing to plan. It's not avoidable by embracing healthy or successful aging on the individual level, everyone reading the same book or something like that and then dying quickly. And it is not fixable by the longevity market. The robots will not save us. There can be this idea that we're just going to have robots rather than humans taking care of us. And that can lead us into true justice problems, not just romances with robots, but it can also get us into the problem of what are the housing and economic and healthcare and educational and other needs of the low-wage home care workforce that is the backbone of who cares for us. In our essay set, Paul Osterman, who's at MIT, wrote about how do we respect this workforce, and we do it through very practical measures at the national, the state, and the local level. So I have very little time available, but I'm going to speed up like a good New Yorker here. So 1 year ago, the Hastings Center published a special report on ethical challenges arising from population aging, focusing on what makes a good life in late life. Remember that question, how shall we live? And what it means to be citizens of an aging society. That question, how do we live together? So this was the cover of the report. There's a postcard version of it out in front, and probably all the sample copies have been stolen, but that's good. We want you to do that. We gave academic presentations at the British Society of Gerontology and the Gerontological Society of America, which met in Boston last November. Jen Malinsky, Emily Greenfield, and I met at Sweet Greens at Copley Square, which should be a crucial place on this map, and hatched the idea for what we're doing today. And then 11 months later, the baby is born. We also had articles in Health Affairs and in Stat News, and have had other conversations that have taken work that started in the academy into this practical domain. And I want to thank Chris Herbert and Dave Luveroff, because they have early on helped to shape how we could go take a publication and make it into something that could be much more hands-on and then inform work going out to your various communities and professional contexts. So thank you. So briefly, how we should live together is an ethical question and a political question, as we're going to hear in the first panel. If the conditions of our aging society means millions of people will live long, need care, and cannot afford the built-in conditions of aging, we should be troubled. If our communities block the kinds of housing older taxpayers and others need, we should be troubled. If resistance to affordable housing or accessible housing reflects stigma toward people who need these types of housing, we should face this problem squarely in our neighborhoods and our communities. So we're going to hear a lot about this, especially in the first panel, I think, but perhaps throughout the day. The afternoon's panel will look at the age-friendly movement and its potential to address problems of inequality that compromise aging in a place. This is the cutting edge of two movements, spatial justice and age-friendliness. University of Manchester environmental gerontologist Chris Phillipson, who wrote for our report, and Tina Buffel are pioneers in collaborating with regional policymakers and community members to design and pilot more equitable approaches to age friendliness in a major economically diverse metropolitan area. And Emily and I were privileged to take part in a symposium with them this summer in Liverpool. Pioneering work on making cities and communities more just is being done here at the GSD as well. It is a great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Tony Griffith, who founded and leads the Just City Lab as a research platform for developing values-based planning methodologies and tools. Ethicists love the sound of values-based tools. That's wonderful. Several years ago, Tony published an essay collection on Just City themes, which I read one afternoon in London this summer. Her introduction, which I've quoted up here, reminds us to be attuned to the values embedded in our frameworks for planning. No one word, whether it's livable, sustainable, equitable, whatever it is going to solve everything. We have to be alive to the complexity, and we must keep striving for justice for all. Thank you. Tony, the floor is yours.